done. Just because the work is in a library doesn't mean the important people in power are going to pay attention to it. You also have to speak on behalf of your research and channel that into influencing those who hold power. To be able to speak truth to power on behalf of your research, you have to be able to get into the room. And I think one key thing I've learned is most people don't read very much. We would like to believe that the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is sitting after work every night, reading every major output in refugee and forced migration studies. We would like to believe that people who are in government sit and read research and are affected by it. For that research to have effect, it has to go beyond the text. It has to be brought to life. And there's no one better to bring research to life than the people who have done that research, who have a passion for that research, who chose that research topic because they're committed to it and they believe in the outcomes it can produce. So how do you get into the room? How do you get your research into the corridors of power? And how do you do it if you're a researcher who's doing a master's degree, who's doing a research fellowship, who's doing a doctorate, who isn't necessarily in a professorship or in a major research institution around the world? Networks are very useful. Who do you know? Who can be a starting point? Do you know someone somewhere in the ministry you're trying to influence who might give you a contact or a lead? Do you know someone who knows someone in a ministry who might be able to give you a contact or a lead? Who can you talk to who might know a person who gives you an entry point, just a starting point? And how can you build on that to follow up and connect with people who might be able to give you a hearing, who might say, fine, I'll hear from you for 15 minutes, I'll have a call with you and you can tell me about that work. Or who might be organising an event or a conference and say, yes, I really like what you've told me about, I can put you on a panel and you can come and talk about that work. That would make a real difference. And it's worth saying that I think an awful lot of organisations would really like to have people with lived experience of displacement come and speak on the basis of research. So being able to access these opportunities, I think, is something that's growing and emerging and can be used. It also takes courage. It needs you to be bold. It's a case of not just waiting to be invited, but actually in some cases being assertive enough to say, I would like to be able to talk about my research. What I have done is important because, and can you open up a space for me to talk about that research, to bring it to you? You don't have to be invited, you can ask. And I think that's often important, to be systematic in identifying the spaces, the places, the people where you believe your work can make a difference. Who needs to hear it? Who would want to hear it? And how can you tell them about it? Conferences and events. They could be academic conferences run by universities or associations of professional associations across academics in particular subject areas, like the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, that increasingly takes place in person and in hybrid form. Conferences that we run at the Refugee Studies Centre, and next year we're going to have a major international conference on recognising refugees with a series of themes, and have both in-person opportunities to present and also online opportunities to present with a mixture of researchers, policymakers, practitioners. There are many opportunities like that that are convened. Places are limited at kind of major UNHCR events, whether kind of nationally, regionally, or globally. But actually, if people are aware of the research you've done, there's a chance they may be able to break down some of those barriers and offer those opportunities. So get your research into the conversation. And if you need to, partner with others, partner with people who are involved in those networks. So your research might speak to a particular practitioner who is sitting in a ministry, sitting in an NGO, sitting in a government, sitting in a community-based organisation. If you partner with them, they might be able to help you get access to a space in which you can discuss and present that research. You might co-author something with someone who's not an academic researcher, but a practitioner. They might bring insights to the research from the very start and might also then be able to create opportunities for you. And this is where co-authorship can be useful. So again, Bharati, you being able to work with Marie Godin, for instance. Hopefully that's something that opens up some doors for being able to present the research in places where she has networks and contacts and you may not. And equally for her, you being able to have networks and contacts that she may not have in Kasarani, in Nairobi, has opened up opportunities for her. So collaboration and partnership can be mutually beneficial and create openings, not just for the research, but for what the research then does to have influence and effect. You can also organize your own event. You can be bold and go, okay, I'm going to have an online event. I'm going to organize a lecture. I'm going to organize a talk, a workshop, a seminar. The technology is there now that you don't have to wait. The technology is there that anyone can organize their own discussion group, their own forum, and be the ones who invite. Be the ones who invite the people you want to talk to into your room at your event. So if you want to be able to speak to UNHCR colleagues, if you want to be able to speak to NGOs, get them to your event. Invite them to come, because it's actually quite difficult to say no if you have an invitation. The reasons to say no are usually, I'm too busy on that day, or that's not relevant to me. But if you're approaching someone and it is relevant to them, and you give them enough notice, it's very hard for them to decline. So if you can structure an event for someone, you can potentially get them into a discussion that you want to have about your work and enable it to have some influence. So it's also worth saying, I was going to mention, that it's not just about the people in the room. So when we have this event here today, there's everybody who's here in the physical room we're in. There's everyone who's online virtually, but there are also all the other people who are not at the event, but know it is happening. They know it's happening because it's gone out on social media. They know it's happening because it's on a program. They know it's happening because people have tweeted about it. So don't underestimate the influence you have when you organize an event. If you decide
it creates a buzz, it creates an awareness, it opens up the next opportunity. So don't be shy if you're at an event or you're organising an event from making sure that even people who can't be there know that it's happened, know that they missed out on something, that they should have been there, because that creates momentum around the agenda and enables it to still have an effect. On the actual presentation, particularly with policymakers and practitioners in mind, my PowerPoint for this presentation is not a good example of an excellent PowerPoint. I pulled it together quite informally. The presentation we saw earlier from Bahati was a much better example of an excellent PowerPoint presentation. It was visual, it was impactful, it combined the evidence with visuals. But if you are going to think about using slides, I think the first question is, do you use slides, don't you use slides? Sometimes, if you're in a room with very limited time to speak, it can be powerful, if you're confident speaking, to build a human connection by not relying on slides. If you can look people in the eye and explain something to them succinctly and clearly, and still have a structure around, say, I like 3 parts, but it just enables you to know where you're going, then sometimes slides are not necessary. Sometimes the connection is broken if people are looking away from the speaker and at a screen. I think one thing though, if you do use slides, is there are slide decks to read and there are slide decks to present. What do I mean by that? In some professions like management consultancy, the slide deck is the way you present your findings. And those slide decks produced by organisations like McKinsey, Bain, Boston Consulting Group, are designed so you give the deck to someone. You give it to them physically so they can read through. And they contain a lot of detail. They're beautiful, but they're very detailed. And many organisations use the same thing. So often, rather than produce a concept note, an international organisation or an NGO might produce a slide deck with an idea, with some plans of something that's going to happen. Those decks to read are very different from the decks you present. Something you present should be much shorter. If it's for a policy or practitioner audience, I'd suggest 7 slides maximum. If it's for an academic audience, I'd suggest 20 slides maximum. You don't need too many slides. More is often less, so that people have impact and you retain their attention. And you need to allow at least 2 minutes per slide. So often people have too many slides with too much text on. Concentrate on the things you really want to get across that will have the impact on the people who are listening. Less is often more. And you can include relevant images, data, and quotes. So what I really liked about the presentation earlier is often there was a photo or an image on the right that brought to life what was on the left. If you're going to use data, choose one point you're going to make of the data. It's very difficult to explain a kind of full graph in detail on a slide. Know what the one point you want to make, that in 2001, this percentage of people were in this position. And let it make that one point for you. It's so often when you speak to policymakers, you want to tell them everything, but give them just a couple of key things, a couple of key data points that they will remember, that they will take away. Don't give them absolutely everything. They don't need all the detail of everything you've done. It can be distilled to the audience. And shape the page in a way which allows it to be visually interesting. It doesn't all have to be squashed up. It doesn't all have to be in one format. It can be divided up. And think about alignments and fonts to be consistent across, because it often just shows a degree of professionalism in the preparation. What to say? So what do you put in the content of your talk? So I think this is one of the key things for me, that insight and information are not the same thing. So often when I listen to researchers at every stage, from full professors to kind of undergraduates doing theses, they confuse insight and information. They want to tell you everything. They've done so much work on the research that they want to tell you everything they did, every conversation they had, every finding that they made. That information is different from an insight. An insight for me is usable knowledge. It's something that the person you're speaking to can actually do something with, that's of value to them, to do something in the world. Now what's insightful for one person will be different to what's insightful for another person. So insight, if you are a protection officer in a UN organisation, is different from insight if you're running a refugee-led organisation doing social protection. It's different from insight if you're a development economist at the World Bank. It's different from what constitutes insight if you're a politician or a head of state. It's different from insight if you're another researcher. But it's a case of considering what is usable knowledge for your audience and distilling that very clearly and being led by that answer. So an academic talk might sequence by telling you about the background and the research puzzles, then giving you the research question, then the theory and the literature, then the methodology, then the findings, the implications, and the conclusion. That would be a fairly standard structure for an academic talk. A policy talk might be structured, and these are just examples, by going, here's the real world context. Here's why this is a problem for someone somewhere and why we did research. Then it might be an overview of the underlying research. So it doesn't have to unpack everything you did, but it might say, we did this research, and we found this, and then the focus might be on 5 key insights. Here are the 5 things we found that matter to you. So that you structure it around the things that are relevant to that audience, rather than everything you found that happened to be relevant for other researchers. The other insight I tend to derive from this, particularly with speaking to policy audiences, but it applies to academic talks, is what management consultants would call answer first, and journalists would call don't bury the leader. And what that basically means is, if you're telling a story of some kind, start with the headline, start with the punchline. It's almost the opposite to telling a good joke. A good joke, you set it up, and then you finish with the punchline. But if you really want to get someone's attention, start by telling them the headline. Start by giving them the insight, and then explain it. Because there's a danger they'll only start listening and really paying attention when they know what you're saying really matters to them. So don't give them all the detail, then why it matters. If you're going through each of the 5 insights, say, this is the insight, and then explain it. So state it first, then explain it, and illustrate it if you need to. And equally, journalists call it don't bury the leader, because the leader is kind of the headline, and if the headline is lurking 2/3 of the way down the article, people might not even read the article. So lead with the most important points. Lead with the things you want people to hear, and then explain them. So let me just finish with a couple of examples of work that we've done in Oxford, where we've had, I think, impact through different routes and pathways, and through reaching audiences, through publishing the research in different ways. And it's work that some of you might be a little bit familiar with. So There's work on refugee-led organisations that we did in Oxford that has become a starting point for the RLO study that's being conducted by the Hub. And I think, in a way, the story of impact around that work has been seize the opportunity. So, with two colleagues in Oxford, Tate Pincock and Ed Eastern Calabria, we did research in Kenya and in Uganda on refugee-led organisations. And it was just a starting point for mapping out the work that refugee-led organisations were doing, often without funding, often below the radar, to show what they were doing and the constraints they faced and the lack of opportunities given by international institutions. Now, that book was published at the very end of 2019, and then the pandemic happened. And when we published the book, people weren't very interested in that work because they were, as ever, concerned that refugee-led organisations might not be as efficient or as effective as great big UN organisations or international NGOs. And then suddenly, from March 2020, there was a massive panic as international NGOs started leaving communities, as international NGOs couldn't access those communities, and suddenly, for the first time, the UN system and donors wanted to start hearing about refugee-led organisations. And so that created an opportunity where before that we turned the book into a policy brief. We'd done a launch of that policy brief at Yared in Kampala, which was really important to be able to do it in communities, but also to bring in NGOs and international organisations. Thanks to colleagues here, we did a seminar series more broadly on the theme by refugees, RLO's role in social protection during COVID-19, and then that message started to disseminate, partly because we had a diversity of actors in the room. We were able to put refugee-led organisations and their leaders in the same virtual space as donor governments, international organisations, NGOs, and structure a conversation around that. And then UNHCR started inviting us and colleagues and RLOs we've worked with into an informal working group around this theme to see what they could develop. We put pieces in media outlets like The Conversation and The Humanitarian. These are publications that are really receptive to articles being produced by people with lived experience of displacement. They reach significant audiences. The New Humanitarian speaks mainly to the humanitarian space. The Conversation is much broader, but is widely read. There is a Conversation UK. There is also a Conversation Africa, with journalists based in Nairobi in particular. So those are really useful outlets, and we reach different audiences by writing more succinctly. We used our networks. We collaborated with colleagues at the local education and refugee research networks to get that research in the hands of the Canadian government. And that was one of the reasons why the Canadian government created the first ever governmental fund to support refugee-led organisations. And it wasn't that we had those networks ourselves, we didn't. It was that colleagues at Learn and Carleton University have those networks and help facilitate that channel. So use your networks and don't be shy about drawing upon them. And then research can often build on to subsequent research if you're able to have an impact and reach those wider audiences. So being able to connect to wider foundations created a means to fund that subsequent work. Another area of work I did a couple of years ago was looking in a very different part of the world at the response to Venezuelan refugees in South America. And this is a region in which I have absolutely no expertise whatsoever. But the Colombian government at the time, in around February, March 2019, was faced with about 1.4 million Venezuelans coming across the border. And they wanted to think through how this could benefit the Colombian economy, how this could be a potential to benefit not just displaced Venezuelans, but also Colombians. And so what they were interested in doing was learning from other regions in the world in which our teams had worked. So learning from what happened in East Africa, learning from what happened in the Middle East, learning from what happened in Europe. And one of the important things was, even though it was quite quick impact research, I didn't spend very long there, I mainly relied on desk study work, the key part of having influence was engaging the research users from the outset. So I was invited to Colombia by USAID and the presidency of Colombia. And being able to work directly with them created immediate channels and pathways to impact. I was able to do field work and field visits with the government to the border regions, key sites in the capital city, to have consultations with key governments like Canada and the European Union, and thereafter to do presentations with the presidency, key embassies, do media interviews in country and internationally, and publish a piece in Foreign Affairs. So it was partly because of those initial connections at the outset of the work that there were the pathways to subsequent impact, producing a policy brief. And I had two objectives coming out of the policy brief. One was to encourage the international community to have a solidarity summit to support the Colombian government's response to integrate Venezuelans and give them access to work and access to social services. And the second was to shift recognition for Venezuelans in Colombia who were not being recognized as people in need of international protection. They were being treated as externally displaced Venezuelans rather than as refugees. Now, those were the recommendations that I made through that work, through the policy brief. For a variety of reasons, not only that work, those two objectives were ultimately possible. Now, of course, this is a very particular case based on networks I had. But this logic of engaging research users from the outset can apply in almost any context and at any scale. If you have in mind the people who will benefit from your research, it might be a community-based organisation, it might be an NGO, it might be a group of people who you know who have a particular challenge in their community. Starting with that conversation at the outset, asking them what they need, why they need it, what evidence will be useful for them to bring the change they care about, is a great way to begin. Because they have a buy-in to the work you produce. So you're not just turning up at the end saying, I did this research, you didn't know about it, here's the research support. You've got your champions, you've got the advocates on behalf of your research. You've engaged in that knowledge exchange throughout, which has built trust with that community, but also ensured that they follow the process, they care about the outcomes, they're bought into it, and have been able to influence and shape it. So if there's a context or a challenge that you care about, engage that community at whatever level. It doesn't have to be a major government. It doesn't have to be the level of the president. It can be any end user who you think has a stake in what you're doing. Involve them from the start, and they'll more than likely be there at the end to help you get the research out there. So I really just wanted to kind of put that on the table to start the conversation, and then be able to focus on questions you've got or ideas you've got. These are by far not the only ways in which you can write up research and disseminate it. They're just some of the insights of things I've learned in trial by error of trying to do work to have an effect, and sometimes failing and sometimes succeeding. So, who would like to go first? Yeah, Tom.
The last two words, thank you very much for the presentation. The last two statements, these are several activities I engaged in as a trial, and sometimes I failed, and sometimes I succeeded. Do you have instances when you failed? And
Yes.
you can share with us, please?
Yes. I have written work that was inadequately engaged with end users for that work, that has sometimes alienated those end users. So, for example, in some of my work I've been critical of UNHCR, and sometimes that's been justified, and sometimes it's probably not been as evidence-based as I would like it to be. And that has sometimes damaged my relationship with the organisation and people in the organisation. And I don't regret criticising the organisation, because I think it's valuable to be able to speak truth to power. But what I learned from that is that sometimes you can take people with you, and sometimes you can be in a stronger position if you take more people with you. And even if you critique people, if you sit down with them and explain to them why you're critiquing them, sometimes they won't listen, but sometimes they might. And if they do, they can become advocates for what you've done. They can become allies. So I think one thing I've learned is when you're critical in your work, you can make enemies. And when you criticise other academics, they often don't like it, they get defensive. And you can find a way to do it which is friendly, which actually recognises that behind all organisations and behind all authors, there are human beings with strengths, weaknesses, vulnerabilities, insecurities. And actually, if you reach out, you can sometimes avoid the need to alienate people. Not always. Sometimes you have to say things where people will just disagree, and you can respectfully disagree with them, and you can critique them, and that's okay. But where there is an opportunity to take more people with you, I think it's always worth trying to do that. Where it's possible to explain to people respectfully why you criticise them, and do it informally before you publish something, it's great to do that. You don't always have time to consult everyone, but in an ideal world you would. I've also learned over time that the research that I do and we do in Oxford needs to be much more engaged with communities with lived experience of displacement. And I would say that a lot of my early work was perhaps not as engaged with communities with lived experience as it should have been. And I think partly I've been affected by some of the work experience that I've had doing research, speaking to people who have said, it's been really fantastic having the opportunity to be a research assistant for you. It's been really great to be able to have that learning opportunity. But what would be really great is if you work with us to co-create, co-design, or gave us the tools and the opportunities to do that. And so getting to the point of doing that, I think, has also been something that I've learned through trial and error. And I think that's a sort of, in a sense, there's a natural process. And actually being prepared to have the courage to be direct and just say it, even to people you see as kind of up there, I think you can step beyond that and feel free to speak your mind and speak freely. And I think never be intimidated by the people in the room based on reputation. It's a hard thing to do to get over that, but to actually engage people as people, not based on their status and their position. So I could probably go on and on about things I've not got right in the past and things I've learned, but that's a few thoughts. Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much, Professor, for highlighting some of the ways we should probably prepare ourselves as a researcher while presenting our work to a certain audience. But I was wondering, how should one prepare himself when you have kind of mixed audience, and in terms of preparation, like presenting and how to address it, like how to disseminate your information, because you have kind of different objectives that you want from each and everyone. So how should one prepare himself also in that case? Thank you.
Thanks, Joel. So I think for a lot of research it's worth thinking in terms of three outputs. So can you produce an academic study, a a policy brief that summarises its, or a brief that's relevant to practice in some way, and a media type output for the general public. And I think that should be the those should be the three things. Generally, not always, but generally, if you do a study in this area, can you aspire to those three things? And you can add things around it. So the media piece might not have to be a written piece, it could be a spoken piece, it could be a YouTube piece, it could be talking head, whatever. But I think in terms of those three areas, ideally have a go at doing all of them. Because the really hard bit is the academic study. The other two can be quite quick. They're important, but they don't take as long once the research is done, so it's a pity not to do them. If you're in a position where you've got a mixed audience in the same room, then I think the first thing is to know what that audience is, know who's there. And I think then you've got a choice to decide who's most important to you in that room, and then you could go and target them, or to aim for the tone and the language which you think will take everyone with you. And if you want to carry a room, then often it's better to do it in a way that takes everyone with you, rather than leaving people behind. But there might be exceptions when you just know that there are some really influential people there, and you've got to take that opportunity to influence them. So you might choose to speak more to them. But generally, I think we try and ensure you are inclusive.
Yes, thank you, Prof, for the enlightening session. My question was in line with the topic in terms of how we write and share our research. We note that in most instances, many people are able to write but not to speak. They are let's say that they are talented when it comes to writing but not when it comes to talking. And I've said that many people like to listen as opposed to reading. So how can one use the strength in terms of, let's say, if someone has strength in terms of writing but not talking, so how can he bridge that gap between writing and then speaking? Because at the end of the day, you have to reach both audience, those who are interested in reading and those who are interested in listening to your presentation. Thank you.
I mean, if you don't feel confident at a particular thing, there are two ways to overcome that. One is to practice and get better, and the other is to work with someone who's really good at it, so they do the thing that they're good at. So I think those are your two options. Practicing makes you better at things. So I got into doing quite a lot of public speaking, partly because at school I was very shy and found it very difficult to stand in front of audiences. And so through that experience, I started to believe that actually most people, with practice and confidence, can begin to speak in front of audiences, but it takes practice and it takes confidence. So if you find it stressful or challenging, then take the opportunity to challenge yourself. You might start in an audience that feels friendly or with people you know, where it feels comfortable, but take the opportunity. But also this is where collaboration comes in. You can work with people who have particular strengths, there's complementary strengths. When I try and build teams, whether in research or generally, I try to work with people who can do things I can't do, who have strengths in areas where I'm weak. And there's no point in me hiring people who are exactly like me, because that just replicates the skills. Teams are stronger when there's complementary strengths. So if one person's great at writing, let them focus on the writing. If one person's great at presenting, maybe let them focus on presenting, but then you've also got the chance to learn from it.
Thanks, Professor Alex, for grade 1 lecture. My name is Matai. I'm Edga Orodi, and I'm also a team lead at Edga Africa, which is a social enterprise compounded by Robidi, led and managed by Robidi. So you talk about academic tradition when it comes to academics have been criticized over time because they don't want to share. As we are moving toward impact-oriented world, they want to remain there. But it's very critical that you have taken that path. of improving the research we are doing at Oxford, and also here at the hub of trying to engage with the local actors, particularly the village organizations. I've been privileged enough to be part of the hub through the online course, and I must say that your research is really incredible, especially when you look at the photographs that are attached to the reports that we use when we are doing the online course. I think if we have more of the same, the academic tradition to really, change toward more of impact instead of, producing a lot of research that is not usable, particularly for refugees. There was an article on the Guardian, I think around August 2018, with the title, "The PhD should be about improving the society, not shaping academic kudos." I really found that title very interesting because it really challenged how current of the previous PhD program have been developed. It's just about the academic titles, not just about producing some usable research that can change life in particular part of the world. So I want to, from the online course, I want to make a suggestion. There's this program they call community engagement, and I really found that one very useful. So I'm wondering if we can transform that, into, because I don't think we make use of it a lot through the online course, because we are also sharing academic kudos. We go to that the distinction, for example, so we learn a lot of time going through, because it's being made. Of course, it's mandatory, but then you don't have a lot of time. You just focus on the grade that you want to achieve. So I want to recommend to the hub if they can provide an opportunity for this organization to come here, as perhaps they have done, to present their work. That, as they say, practice makes perfect. So we can present our work using the slide presentation that you suggested, and some of the research that we have done on coming up with a better research that can influence policies, that can, also change someone to do what you want to do. So I don't think that can be done. If they can organize a seminar where this organization can come, do some presentation, so that we put in practice what we have done online and some of the experiences that we have had. Thank you.
Thanks, Matai. Great to meet you, and lots of really good points there. In starting with universities, I think many universities are gradually changing to kind of engage with an impact agenda. But there is still a tradition amongst many colleagues in academic life that the high point of academic life is producing excellent academic work that gets in top-ranked peer-reviewed journals and may or may not have impact on people's lives. I think the sort of defense of that is that it's what generates ideas, it's what challenges received wisdom. I think for people like me that want to be practical and engaged with real-world challenges, I think there's much more that universities can do to at least value and incentivize academics to have careers that do impactful work and has real-world application. I think my experience of academic life is that it's possible often to make choices about what kind of academic you want to be. I recognise that I'm very privileged to be in an elite university, but I've found it possible to choose to be a different kind of academic from some other colleagues. Not necessarily the right kind or the wrong kind, but different. To have one foot in traditional academic work and teaching, but one foot that tries to engage a bit more with policy and practice. And I think what I've found is it's not a choice between necessarily high quality academic work and impact, but the two are actually complementary. Because actually the research gets stronger when you engage people and you get to build networks and understand people's experiences, whether in organisations or individuals or communities, and then you can bring that back, and your research is better because you have close contact with the people who are affected by it. So to me it's not a choice between academic excellence and trying to have impact and engagement. The two should be a virtuous circle where one complements the other, and I think more and more that needs to be recognised. The other thing about engagement is still too often where there is engagement, it tends to be policy engagement, business engagement, or public engagement. And that community word you mentioned is too often neglected. So what is it for research to engage with communities, as distinct from, say, formal organisations that already have influence? What is it for research to not just think about influencing the powerful, but influencing actors at a grassroots level who can make a difference and have an appetite for what universities and research can offer, both the educational side that you alluded to, but also the evidence base that you referred to. I think it's a really exciting idea to say, what could it do to have a conversation between research and community-based organisations and refugee-led organisations? What might it be like to be able to bring a handful of refugee-led organisations, their leadership, their staff here and have a conversation about some of those areas of skills, and to think about what research means in a practitioner context for those kinds of organisations. So I think we'll need to ask the RH leadership team about that, but we can certainly put it on the agenda as something we discuss, and it would be valuable to have a chat about that over the next couple of days and hear more about what it's like. And I think, Anthony, is that on this? Or separate? Just a moment.
Thank you. We have a question that came on Zoom. Julia is asking, thanks first, Alex, for the presentation. My question is, if your output is an academic paper that might be complex in terms of language, how would one filter down to the community to share with them the research findings? This came out yesterday in one of the discussions where a community leader highlighted that the research findings should be brought to those same communities in a language that they can understand.
And then just to follow up another very double-barreled question from Mohammed, who is based in Nairobi as well. He says, for aspiring researchers with lived experience trying to break into forced migration research, what do you think are some of the tensions and challenges of positionality in the research process?
Great. Thanks, Julia and Mohammed. I think in terms of translation, the simple response is you have to change the language. You have to remove the academic jargon. And that's sometimes a really uncomfortable process. But there's usually a more simple way of putting things. You can usually describe the main insights that come from academic work in non-academic language. And it may be slow, it may be painstaking, but if you really want to communicate with people who are not in that world, then it's just something you need to engage with and try to do. And I think for academics, often it's much easier to write the complex sentences than it is to write the simple sentences. And short sentences that use everyday language, I think could be really powerful ways to communicate underlying complex ideas, if you can make that happen. Mohammed's question about positionality. What are the tensions in positionality of being a researcher with lived experience of displacement and researching in those communities? I mean, there are massive amounts of benefit that you can identify the research agenda based on your own experiences, but also the experiences of those in your communities. You can identify the questions that other people might not be able to see who are from outside those communities. You can engage in conversations with people who might be suspicious of or skeptical about outside researchers. You can do so in a language that is often connected to those people. You can do so with a degree of sensitivity that's not available to external researchers. I think one of the areas where there is a potential tension comes from kind of the anthropological idea of participant observation. So anthropologists use ethnographic methods which rely upon the idea of having 1 foot in and 1 foot outside the community, being part insider and part outsider. And the difficulty of being fully an insider is that you can't look necessarily objectively from the outside. You can't look dispassionately at the context and necessarily see it in a way that allows you to critically engage. You might also have a set of obligations towards that community. So there might be certain things that you can't write or don't feel comfortable writing because it affects your ongoing relationships of trust that might be compromised by writing those things. So to be critical of your own community is not only very difficult because you see it in a particular way through your own cultural lens, through the background of having shared social norms with that community, but you also may or may not have an interest or a set of obligations that you feel to not be overly critical or to be supportive of that community. And so I think there's a tension that can come from that. But I think the key is to kind of acknowledge that positionality, recognise it, make it explicit, see the strengths, see the challenges, and do what you can to reflectively address some of those challenges and tensions. I see a few hands. I can see Bahati here.
Why don't we start with the net and then pass it on?
Okay, hello. Yes? Right, thank you. I think I'm just going to reference a little bit about my experience as a person with forced displacement and doing my research in Oxford and some of the challenges. So my supervisor once told me a segment says that academia is lonely, vicious, and very competitive. So when you perceive that statement from a person with forced displacement and how limited supervision or the support that there is in Oxford when it comes to researching certain topics outside the RSC, it becomes, I think, the question becomes maybe triple or 3 times or 4 times real for students who are struggling in terms of not only trying to convince researchers but also others that perhaps the approach that we're taking to understand this issue is not the best way. Maybe this is another perspective. So I'm just curious to see, do you see any changes in terms of specifically places like Oxford that are producing knowledge on migration in terms of supporting students outside the RSC with their research that's focusing on refugees or other kinds of displacement issues?
Yeah, lonely, vicious, and competitive. I think that probably characterises some people's experiences, particularly of what it's like being a PhD student in a lot of universities, where you've got your own project, it can be quite isolated, where the next steps in academic life are very competitive, because at each stage there are fewer and fewer opportunities, and you've almost got to be higher achieving as you go through, and that puts a lot of pressure on people, that there's that triage process as you go through. And I think people often do feel less supported than they should be. So I'll speak very frankly, I think things are improving dramatically in Oxford, but there is still some way to go. What I would say is that there's inconsistency, that there are pockets of outstanding supervision and support progress, and colleagues who go out of their way to support students across the board, personally, professionally, and with career development. And then there are spaces of neglect and spaces of inadequate supervision. One of the roles I have in Oxford is that I'm responsible for graduate training across the whole social science division, so 14 social science departments. And in that context, I meet with a lot of graduate students from different departments individually. And a lot have very good experiences, some have mediocre experiences, and some face real challenges. I think what we're getting slightly better at is hearing the challenges and finding ways to address that, so that if people are in isolation or feel isolated or feel that they're struggling, they know that there's another place they can reach out to. It's not dependent on the research centre they're part of, the department they're part of, or that supervision arrangement. There's somewhere else to go. So I think that's being built in more and more. I think particularly on the experience of researchers with the experience of displacement in Oxford, or by extension actually people who come outside Oxford or outside the British system or outside of Europe or North America, I think we're learning that there are often particular challenges that people face, that accommodation often isn't fit for purpose for someone who's arriving there for the first time, that it's far too far away from the campus, or that people with families need far greater support, that if they get a scholarship they're not just supporting themselves often, they're supporting their family, or that there may be challenges of language adaptation to an academic style of writing that need additional sources of support. And so I think one thing that I'm really pleased to be able to say is that Oxford is launching something called Refugee Academic Futures that is now soft launched on the website and will be pushed much more strongly by the university. And it's going to combine a much bigger push for scholarships for people from displacement backgrounds with a cohort support programme, including mentorship, for degrees across the entire university: social science, humanities, medical sciences, mathematics, life sciences. Those are the four main blocks of university. So I think we're getting somewhere. And it's not just for displaced communities. There's more support for people coming from backgrounds where when they arrive in Oxford, they might need that different type of support. So I think, unfortunately, there continues to be elements of what you described, not just in Oxford, but at elite and non-elite universities around the world. But there are increasing efforts to make those fewer and further between.
Okay, thank you very much. I was looking at this aspect about trial and error in the research. When we do research, we hope for a positive impact from that research. One of the pathways to impact is involvement. Now, here is a scenario where I've completed my research, and maybe that research is about the community. There's a problem within the community, and I'm targeting the policy makers. Having done that, I have involved both the groups. I've reached to the policy makers and I've reached to the community. But at the end of the day, there is no feedback, there is no change, there is no impact. Now my question is, when do I consider my research as an error or a success?
It's a lovely question, and I also like the way you explain that iterative process in research, that you can involve people early on, you can continue to involve them as you discuss your preliminary findings, you can involve them at the dissemination phase. It's not just at the end, it's not just at the start and the end. You can find ways to do it potentially all the way through. And some types of research design need to evolve. So sometimes you might design a particular research methodology, trial it, find it doesn't yield results that are really insightful or important, but come away and design a second phase of that research to follow up. So I think if you're in that position of having produced research, having disseminated it, and nothing changes, it's a very abstract way of looking at it, but there are different reasons one could imagine that could take place. One could be that the people who hold power don't want to change. So one way of thinking about that is maybe there's a follow-up piece of research on the political economy of why the people in power have an interest in not changing their positions. So you could actually do research on the reception of the research to understand what the barriers and obstacles are, because at least then you understand why things are not changing. It might also be that you've got to look self-critically at the research. Was the research you've been doing really insightful enough to persuade the people you needed to persuade? Did you ask the right questions? Did you get the right kind of data? Did you use the right methods to get that kind of data? So I think you probably go through a period of sort of self-reflection. What did you do that you could have done differently? But then a reflection on what the other barriers and obstacles were, and try to understand them. But I think all research is rarely complete. If you're really committed to a particular topic, you're not going to solve it with one piece of research. So one thing I'm really focused on in my work is socioeconomic rights for refugees. That's not going to be solved by one piece of research. That's going to have research that has no impact some might, other research. The other thing about research is it can be ignored, and then may have relevance at a point in the future. So when I was talking earlier about the energy-led organisations research, the book came out in 2019, and it was really hard to get anyone to listen to it. And then in 2020, it wasn't because of anything we'd done, but it was because of a change in the world that suddenly people were interested. And a lot of the most impactful research becomes relevant after the research has been done, because something happens. So there was research, for instance, in the 1980s and 1990s on what was then called climate refugees, people who were displaced as a result of environmental change and climate change. At the time, that research wasn't considered particularly relevant or important. Wait 20 years, and suddenly that research was of interest and was being cited. So sometimes it's just that researchers come ahead of their time.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for presenting. I just want to know what is the academic framework for the research validity from a research to another. What the academic framework before for research to still be valid? As I'm talking in the case of, let's say, economy research which was done in 2019, then COVID. Yeah, you understand what I ask?
Yeah, so research validity is different for different types of research. So the kind of, what makes a particular method something that's been done in a valid way varies from method to method. So the methods can have validity in and of themselves, regardless of what the findings are. If you're using quantitative methods, for instance, if you want your data to be representative, it needs to be based on a particular type of random sampling, for instance. And if it's not, it won't be representative of the community that you're focusing on. To have the ability to derive correlations, relationships between variables in data, you need to be able to have a large enough sample size to have the power to have that analysis. If you want to move from a correlation, an association between two variables, to a causal relationship, there are a whole set of other criteria you would have to look at. For quantitative social scientists, there are things that tell you that the direction of causality goes in one direction rather than going in both directions. So different methods have different academic standards, methodological standards of rigor. For qualitative research, those are different standards of validity. You can think about standards of validity that actually are around other things like research ethics, like adequate consultation and participation of affected communities. You might have standards of validity around thinking about, reflectively about the power relations that took place in your interviews and focus groups. So there are different standards of validity in a way.
partners and some organizations work on a piece of research, but then just wondering, are there opportunities for publishing some of the work that we do in academic journals? And then how do we convince policymakers, for example, that our research is grounded in, has followed rigorous methodologies if it has not been published? This is not only for RRH, but also for other pieces of research that other colleagues might be undertaking, targeting policymakers and other government NGO officials. Thank you.
It's a really great question. I mean, I'd come back to that point about aspiring to have multiple outputs for any given research project. And on the academic side of the work, it could be sequenced. It could be that initially there's a working paper that publishes the findings quickly so they can still be out there and relevant. And a working paper published, for instance, by for a lot of the research outputs that come from the RLRH, that whether immediately or subsequently, that research still gets through a peer review process and is published. One way to ensure that is to do the research in a way that follows good methodology, that relates it to academic literature, that situates it in the literature. But the work that I see coming out of the RLRH at the moment strikes me as clearly having the potential to be published in high quality journals in the field. And if there is a need for advice, support, engagement from people who are published in academic journals, then the network of the hub, I think, can provide and support that. But also increasingly that there are journal editors who have a commitment to trying to support publishing from people of a range of different backgrounds who have not yet published in academic journals. Everyone's first academic journal article is hard because it's new. Everyone early in a research career finds it hard to navigate a culturally quite strange process of peer review. And there are editors like the Journal of Refugee Studies editors who really want to be able to provide advice. So just as I said earlier, sort of have courage. If you want to publish in a peer review journal, you don't need to just go to the submit page and then have your journal sent off to anonymous reviewers and then come back with whatever reviews it gets. It may be positive, but it may be reject. You can actually go to the editors first and say, I want to publish the piece, this is what I've got so far, can you give me any advice on what, if anything, I need to change before this goes out to peer review? So I think if you want support and guidance, it's having the courage to reach out for it. And journal editors have a stake in this because they want really good pieces. And journal editors in the refugee and forced migration studies space really do want to publish work that combines academic rigour with the lived experiences of displacement. So I think have that as one of the objectives to legitimate the work, not the only objective. And if you have doubts and questions about it, seek advice, guidance and support, because I think it will be available.
Thank you.
Are we handing back to you now, Anthony?
I'm very happy for you to close the session.
What's happening next?
So we're going to take a short break for just about 5 minutes, and then we're going to be rearranging the room a little bit, and then Monty and Alice will give a presentation. It's going to last for about an hour and a half, and then we'll break for lunch around 1:30.
Thank you very much for a great conversation, and I'm happy to continue individually afterwards. Thanks. continue.